My name is Tony Burke. I'm the chair of the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom, and we've been working hard all year as a campaign, but also jointly with the Institute of Employment Rights and various unions, to promote this whole issue of fair employment rights. And more recently, if you look on the reverse of the leaflet that's been handed out, the Manifesto for Collective Bargaining, and we've got to plug this book. There's copies here. Caroline's got copies at the back, written by Keith Ewing and John Hendy. And I think it's fair to say perhaps this will be the first time at a Labour Party conference this week where the issue of collective bargaining is going to be well and truly discussed. We've got a fantastic array of speakers this afternoon, comrades. And the first speaker today, on behalf of the TUC, is our good friend Sarah Veal, Head of Equalities and Employment Rights. Sarah, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. I'm going to stay sitting down because the danger if I stand up is that you won't be able to hear me. You might not consider that to be very dangerous, but as I'm here, I'll sit down and you can hear me even if you can't see me. We are living through, at the moment, an unprecedented time of attack, both on trade unions and on individual employees. We have at the moment in Parliament something called the lobbying bill, which is one of the most atrociously drafted and actually one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation, even going by the appalling standards of this coalition government. I want to just say a word about Part 3. Part 2 is obnoxious because that seeks to ensure that trade union voice, and actually also the voice of other civil society organisations, is completely and utterly blocked during the election process. But we shouldn't lose sight also of Part 3, which imposes a whole new layer on already heavily over-regulated trade unions. It's a piece of absolute nonsense. It's very, very dangerous because, apart from anything else, it will give succour to those employers who seek to get injunctions out against trade unions who are attempting to call their members out on industrial action. And it'll allow them a second avenue whereby they can try and extract information about the membership who are being balloted, and no doubt use that in furtherance of injunctions against those unions, which of course they already get with startling ease in a number of cases. That bill has to be defeated, that bill has to be got rid of. But it's also important to bear in mind that there are other measures which have been lurking very near the surface, and be under no doubt whatsoever, colleagues, that if there were to be a full-blooded Tory government, and even possibly while the Condems are still in power, they've got various things that they would like to do to us as well. In particular, they want to introduce thresholds in strike ballots, exactly the same as we have in the recognition legislation, which we were always opposed to. And what they're suggesting is that there should be a 40 or a 50% threshold if you're Boris Johnson, which means that effectively, when you're running a strike ballot, anyone who abstains in that ballot would count as a vote against, because what you have to get is the threshold of the yes votes up to a 40 or 50% percentage of all those who are being balloted. So that's a really completely, utterly unreasonable threshold to impose, and one, of course, which doesn't apply anywhere else in society. There's no requirement for MPs, who are supposed to be running the country, to get past those sort of hurdles when they're elected. There's no requirement for Boris Johnson to get past his 50%, and indeed he didn't. And yet he's responsible for spending a huge amount of taxpayers' money. So it's quite clearly a blatant attack on trade unions that they're just waiting to do. But we need to look as well at the attacks on individual workers. We've got a situation now in the UK where there's a massively growing number of people on highly precarious contracts. I think everyone knows now, we've heard Ed Miliband speaking about the need to introduce some sort of legislation now to curb the use of zero-hours contracts. But it's not just zero-hours contracts, is it? It's also overuse of agency workers, often to substitute what should be proper paid jobs for our people. And also bogus self-employment, which I'm delighted to see the Labour Party is committing itself to do something about in the construction industry, where it's absolutely rife. So there's all those things which are being taken up. I noticed the other day an MP called Jacob Rees-Mogg. You can probably guess what his class background is by his name. I don't think He lived on a council estate, and I don't suppose he went to a state school. But he said that 0 hours contracts were essential to the economic recovery, which they're now pretending is going on the basis that it would allow, quotes, the efficient use of labour. I don't know about you, but it makes my skin creep when I hear Tories talking about the use of labour as though we were back in the Victorian times. Dickens wrote Hard Times, where he described labour and hands. We're completely anonymised to them now. We're just, things that make the products, that provide the services. We're not even humanised anymore by them. It's very, very frightening indeed. But just moving on, there's much greater speakers than I about to come on. But just to say that I think we do have big battles on our hands. We have to fight all the time the myths that are perpetuated in the Tory media about how we have to have 0 hours contracts, we have to stop immigration, we have to cut benefits. All these things are absolutely critical to economic recovery. Of course, there's no such thing, but unfortunately, as the polls show at the moment, people are swallowing these arguments. So we have a huge job on our hands just to get out there and persuade people out there in community groups that the papers are wrong and those things are actually causing the problem. It's not us that caused the problem, it's the people who wrecked the country a few years ago, which wasn't the Labour government, it was those greedy bankers. The people at the top, I have to add that quickly because I'm sitting here with United's General Secretary, I don't mean people who work in the banks, I mean the financiers who run them right up at the top and operate largely in the City of London. But what do we want in the union movement from an incoming Labour government? The key thing, which I know John and Keith are going to speak in a much more erudite way than I am, is to give some sort of proper support for the extension of collective bargaining into key sectors of the economy, to set wages and conditions, and to make sure that all working people are paid a living wage and do work reasonable hours and under reasonable conditions. And I think the only way you're going to get that effectively is through union strength and through collective bargaining. I also do think, however, we're going to need a legislative prompt on some of the individual rights issues, and it is time, and Ed Miliband is absolutely right, to talk about doing something about 0 hours contracts. And at the TUC, we've been discussing with our affiliated unions a whole range of measures, some of which I think Ed was talking about or will be talking about, such as, for example, a presumption of employee status. It's quite ridiculous in the UK that you have this categorisation of workers, employees, some of whom have rights and some of whom don't. And employers are working out really quite quickly now how to move people into the camp that has fewer rights. And we would argue that something has to be done, and an easy way of doing that would be to start from the premise that everybody is an employee unless their employer can prove in a court that they're something else. So that means at least you've got those basic rights, and it's not, the onus isn't going to be on you, the individual worker, to pay a huge fee to go to an employment tribunal and probably lose your case because the law is so restrictive in the UK. And my final point as well, not to leave this alone because it is important, we do need to have modernisation of our industrial action laws. They are archaic, they are absolutely ridiculous, they still don't allow for electronic balloting, which is quite absurd when you think about the way in which most workers now operate. But most importantly, they still allow employers at the drop of a hat to get an injunction out, even where a vast majority of the people who've been balloted are quite clearly and provably in favour of the industrial action. So we have to make sure that we continue to press the Labour government on this. No one wants to take industrial action. People don't do it for fun. You lose your wages, and with the best will in the world, unions can't afford to keep on paying you probably what you would earn if you were going into work. But we do have to have that tool at our disposal, because if you're talking about free trade unions, and in any democratic society, we have to have those. It's essential that they do have an unfettered right to take their members out on industrial action as a last resort to press employers, because otherwise we don't have strong voice in the workplace, and unless we have strong voice in the workplace, we're simply not going to be able to restore the rights that people need and to make a real difference to the economy. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing all the other speakers. Thank you.
This fringe meeting, great work that's been done by the TUC. Our next speaker is Katie Clark, who is MP for North Ayrshire and Arran. Katie has been helping us in the various campaigns on employment rights, collective bargaining, and we're very, very grateful for the work that she's done on our behalf and the assistance and advice she gives us. Katie, you're welcome.
I will stand up, and if you can't hear me, please let me know. First of all, can I thank you for inviting me today and for having this meeting. We're hearing some very good announcements from the Labour Party on individual rights, on 0 hours contracts, and there is work going on about things like underemployment, part-time workers, parental rights, and I hope that in the lead-up to the next general election we're going to hear a lot more said about people's rights at work and the individual rights that Labour will create. But what this meeting is about, and the issue that as a movement we simply haven't really been able to get onto the agenda successfully, is the collective rights that we have as workers. The rights of trade unions to act on behalf of their members and to operate freely in a democratic society. We had 13 years of a Labour government where, despite the attempts of some of us to try and get some changes in relation to what the leader of the Labour Party told us were the most restrictive Labour legislation in Western Europe, despite that, we really weren't able to get anything done to improve the trade union legislation in this country. And I think we've got a massive challenge at the moment as we lead up to the next general election to try to persuade the leadership of the Labour Party that it's safe to come forward with rights for trade unionists in this country. I think, in many ways, our leadership are scared to take on this issue. I often feel that they feel we're still in the 1970s, the 1980s. But the reality is that trade unions are incredibly popular in this country. And one of the reasons, perhaps, that more people aren't members is because trade unionists don't have enough rights. People don't see the point. It's expensive to join a trade union. And why should you do it if that trade union isn't able to deliver for you? And therefore I feel that we have to grapple with this whole issue of collective rights. And we have to find a way of putting some of the types of policies that Sarah's been talking about, that others on this platform have done so much work in putting together forward as Labour policies that we will deliver on. And I think that's essential for Labour. Labour was created by the trade unions to give representation to ordinary working people in Parliament. But our movement is more than about Parliament. It's more than about elections. It's about enabling all of us to collectively get involved in the society in which we live. And trade unions are one of the essential ways that we can do that. As Sarah has said, we are seeing attack after attack from this government on trade unionists, in legislation, but also in words. The constant attacks on Labour's links with the trade unionists, the constant attacks on trade unions by senior politicians, including people like Joe Swinson, the Liberal Democrat MP, who is taking through much of this legislation at the moment. The lobbying bill is going through Parliament. It's being rushed through Parliament. It's a complete dog's dinner. We've not had hardly any opportunities to examine what's in it, and it's going to be off to the Lords a few days after we get back from conference recess. And I very much hope that the Lords do spend a very long time on this bill, looking at every clause, because we need to make sure that the arguments are put as to why it is simply unacceptable in this country to try and tie the trade unions up in even more red tape. Time after time, I hear Tory MPs standing up complaining about bureaucracy and red tape. But when it comes to the trade union movement, their language changes. They show very, very clearly what side they're on. Let's make sure that we make very clear what side we're on and give our movement the power to deliver for our members. Thank you.
Thanks for your support, and we know that you'll support the campaign and the Institute of Employment Rights in the House of Commons. We move into the lawyer's slot, and two of the most eminent employment rights experts in the UK, who've done a tremendous amount of work for both the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom and the Institute of Employment Rights. And again, there's the book written by Keith and John is available at the back, and we hope that you'll purchase a copy. So to lead us in on this discussion, around the collective bargaining manifesto that's been produced, but all the other issues connected with employment rights. Can I introduce Professor Keith Ewing, President of the Institute of Employment Rights.
Thanks very much, Tony, and to the previous speakers for a very rousing start. Some of you will have seen last week an article in the Guardian newspaper, I think it was in the comment is free section, where somebody said that the next election is going to be the employment rights election, or the labour law election, I think, is what he said. So not just the cost of living election, but the employment rights election, because the two, I guess, are very, very closely related. And I must say that if that's the case, that as a Labour Party member, that at the moment I'm very disappointed by what is coming out from the party leadership in terms of employment rights in 2015. I mean, what we've got announced over the weekend is a commitment to better enforce the minimum wage. Well, that's fine. What we've also got is some talk about a living wage, but I'm not quite clear where that's now going to go. I mean, there was talk of the TUC, a speech made there about maybe driving this through Labour local authorities, but question as to whether this is going to be mandatory, I don't know, living wage. Talk about 0 hours contract as a third issue on the agenda, but clearly not a commitment to abolish 0 hours contracts, maybe a commitment to reform and to make them work a bit better and less harshly against the worker. And some welcome commitments as well, I think, on the question of apprenticeship. Two commitments on apprentices which have been made over the course of the last couple of weeks. But so far as I can tell, there's not much more at the moment which is going to nourish us for the next 12 months. Nothing on blacklisting, so far as I can tell, in terms of the detail of how we're going to deal with this outrageous scourge on our country, the construction industry in particular. Nothing on unfair dismissal rights. Are we going to restore the right not to be unfairly dismissed, or are we going to have to continue to work for 2 years before we can bring a claim for unfair dismissal? Nothing about restoring the right to be consulted in the event of a collective redundancy, which the present government has reduced the time frame. And nothing, again, in terms of the fees for employment tribunals, which will make access to justice, which will take access to justice way out of the pocket of most workers. We're looking at workers now having to pay £1,200 to bring an unfair dismissal claim. Where do we stand on that question in 2015? So at the present time, so far as I can tell, over the course of the weekend at least, the burden is falling on the minimum wage. That is going to be our big message so far. Now, and this is maybe the wrong audience for this, but I don't want to rain on the minimum wage. But I have to say that I think when I hear people talk about the minimum wage as being as important for the last government as the NHS was for the Attlee government, I just think that this is completely out of touch with reality. Remember the minimum wage when it was first introduced. The minimum wage was introduced at £3 an hour. It was insulting. The minimum wage has been increased, obviously, since 1998, 1999, when it was introduced. But today, if you can get 40 hours a week, if you're lucky enough to get a 40-hour week, and you're paid on the minimum wage, it will guarantee you an income of about £12,000 a year. No overtime rate if you manage to get over 40 hours a week. And that £12,000 a year, which the minimum wage will guarantee you, if my sums are right, is less than half the national average male wage in this country at the present time. So we've got to do better. We've got to do better than this in the next Parliament. Better than the national minimum wage as a way of regulating pay, as a way of regulating the problem of the cost of living. If we're serious about the problem of the cost of living, we've got to raise wages. We've got to equalise incomes between the different classes of people in this country. And the only way by which we can raise wages and equalise incomes is to invest state resources into rebuilding the collective bargaining machinery which exists in this country. Now, when I started work in 1978, sorry if you've heard this before, when I started work in 1978, I joined the union, I was covered by a collective agreement, I was one of 82% of British workers who was covered by a collective agreement. The great story of the last Labour government, or at least one of the great stories of the last Labour government, is the decline from that level of 82% continued to fall. The decline continued inexorably. The decline that started in 1979 continued at pace throughout the period of the last Labour government. With Major stopped being Prime Minister, 36% of British workers, only 36% were covered by a collective agreement. When Gordon Brown stopped being Prime Minister, that had fallen to about 33%, and it continues to decline, and the figures we have available to us at the moment suggests that about 23% of British workers now covered by a collective agreement. Well, that's got to change. If we're serious about raising pay, serious about equalising incomes, serious about the cost of living problem, then we've got to invest state resources into the collective bargaining system in this country, as we did in the past during periods of austerity, for example, in the 1930s, and as other countries have done and continue to do. If you look at the position, the relative position in other European countries, Germany, for example, the powerhouse of the European Union, 67% of German workers covered by a collective agreement. And that is at the low level in terms of our European competitors. We've got to get back from 23% back to 67 and actually start climbing again, so that every worker in this country is protected by a collective agreement. And what we suggest in this wonderful booklet, which is available only for £10 a time, and you can buy it on the way out. In fact, you will not be allowed to leave unless you do buy it on the way out, £10, maybe even a discount for multiple copies. But we suggested here various steps that could be taken by a Labour government to help rebuild the institutions that we have allowed to decay over the course of my and looking around many other working lives in this room. Before I sit down, let me just say one thing which makes me feel quite ashamed. I was in Ireland last week at a trade union conference. The conference was addressed by the Deputy Prime Minister of the Irish Republic. The Deputy Prime Minister of the Irish Republic is a member of the Irish Labour Party, who is a junior partner in coalition with a right-wing government. The deputy leader of the Irish Labour Party made a commitment to a trade union conference, no sense of embarrassment, he made a commitment to a trade union conference that within the next few weeks they will be bringing forward legislation to deal with the question of collective bargaining. He also made a commitment that they will be bringing forward legislation to repeal or to reverse a decision of the Supreme Court which had prevented collective agreements from being made universally applicable to all the workers in a particular industry. Now that can be done by a Labour leader as a junior partner in a coalition government. What we would like is a Labour leader who is a majority partner and governing on his own, or governing as a majority party in a coalition. We would like to hear the same commitment from him. We want to see collective bargaining restored. Otherwise, what is our offer to the people of this country in 2015? Vote Labour, and we will ensure that you will be paid at least £12,000 a year. Not much of an offer. Thank you.
Moving on swiftly to the next speaker, the Vice President of the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom, co-author of the book, which we're heavily plugging, as you'll have heard, John Hendy QC.
on what basis a law professor and a QC presumed to address the labour movement on the benefits of collective bargaining. I can still say that. Half natural arrogance. There's in fact a particular reason. And the particular reason is that the requirement for collective bargaining is a fundamental human right. That's not just Council's opinion. The right to collective bargaining is written into international treaties which the United Kingdom has signed, ratified, and by which it is bound. We haven't got time for a law lecture today. For those who are taking notes, ILO Convention number 98. The first government in the world to sign it was the British government in 1950. Signed now by almost every other country in the world and binding on every member state of the International Labour Organisation. The European Social Charter of 1961 in Article 6 requires the promotion of collective bargaining. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, Article 28. And 5 years ago, in the European Court of Human Rights, that court held that as part of Article 11 of the European Convention, the right to be a member of a trade union is, as an essential element, they held, an essential element, the right to collective bargaining. So the argument that we're putting forward is not simply a matter of self-interest for the trade union movement, it's a matter of fundamental international law binding on this country. And the fact, as Keith has told you, that collective bargaining coverage has declined from 82%, 8 out of every 10 workers covered in 1979, to 23% last year, means that Britain is an international law breaker. Because instead of smashing up the collective bargaining arrangements in this country, our government, all our governments, over the last 30 years have been under a duty to promote collective bargaining. But colleagues, the legal argument is not the one, obviously, that's going to win the day. There are other arguments as well. And in this audience, of course, I don't need to tell you about democracy at the workplace, about the fact that collective bargaining is the only way in which workers can have their voice heard at work. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we still have 6.5 million members of trade unions. That's to say more than 1 in 10 of the entire population, from the newborn to the old age pensioners, still members of trade unions, even though collective bargaining has declined from 82% to 23%. That means, if you do the maths, there's at least 1 million members of trade unions who don't have the benefit of collective bargaining. That means that they are living in the hope that their trade unions will be able to be heard on their behalf at the workplace, even though they are not at the moment. So the restoration of collective bargaining is essential for workplace democracy. It's also fundamental for social justice, for justice at the workplace. Everybody in this audience knows the inequality of bargaining power between the worker on the one side and the employer on the other. There's only one way of redressing that, only one way, and that is collective bargaining by trade unions on behalf of working people. But there's yet another argument as well, and that is the economic argument. There's an economic argument in favour of collective bargaining. One of the contradictions of capitalism is, of course, that employers want low-paid workers but high-paid consumers. That's the fundamental contradiction. And the policies that have been pursued for the last 30 years in this country have driven down wages. Everybody knows that the purchasing power of the average worker now is, I forget how many hundreds of pounds less than it was in 2008. Now, in order to restore purchasing power to workers, we have to have collective bargaining. As Keith has said, the minimum wage ain't going to do it, nor, in my view, is the living wage either. Collective bargaining is the only way to drive up wages, and that has an economic purpose, because it creates demand in the economy. Working people don't put their money in the Cayman Islands or in trust funds. Working people actually spend their money. They create demand in the economy. That increases the tax share that governments can take. It stimulates the economy, it stimulates production and services and so forth. And if we're going to dig ourselves out of the economic hole that we're in, only collective bargaining can assist in that end. And there's a particular facet of the economic argument that, of course, is close to the heart of everybody in this room. And that is the massive growth of inequality in this country over the last 30 years. We all know the effects of inequality. Inequality in economic inequality leads to inequality in healthcare, inequality in life expectancy, inequality in perinatal death, in mortality, and so forth and so on. But it's interesting that the increase in inequality over the last 30 years mirrors almost exactly the decline in collective bargaining coverage. And only when we restore collective bargaining, and that means power to the trade unions, can we reverse the decline in equality that we've suffered over the last 30 years. So my appeal to the Labour Party, like Keith, is that we must restore collective bargaining, particularly industry-wide collective bargaining. That's what the Whitley councils that were set up in the First World War in order to aid reconstruction were for. That's why collective bargaining was accepted in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Australia and Canada in the 30s as the way out of the slump of the 1930s. That's what we have to do today. Thanks for listening.
It's unbelievable. Comrades, before I introduce our final speaker, just to give a plug to the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom and the Institute of Employment Rights. On the leaflet, you'll see that there are websites and social media. Keep up with the work that we're doing both in the UK on employment rights, but also internationally. Now, those of you this morning that were in the hall will recall that we heard a fantastic speech on employment rights, an absolutely fantastic speech, which got a great reception. In fact, it got a standing ovation at the Labour Party conference on employment rights. That speech was made by General Secretary of my union, Len McCluskey. Len.
Thank you, Tony, and fantastic contributions from all the speakers.
Yeah.
I've had to rip up all my notes. Most of the facts have been covered by them. But, you know, the important thing, and I want to thank everybody here for being at this fringe meeting, is the fact that we are having a fringe meeting here at the Labour Party about trade union freedoms and collective rights. And that we are having a debate, as we did in the hall this morning, about collective rights, because that's really what it's all about, putting it back onto the agenda. As Katie said, and Katie, I want to thank you for all the work that you do on behalf of Unite members and other workers on a whole range of subjects. It's good to have you working with us. Katie made the point, of course, that previous Labour governments have failed to tackle the issue of collective rights, and she spoke about individual rights, and she's quite right. I mean, I think one of the characteristics of New Labour, of so-called Blairism, was a radical belief in individualism. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. The last Labour government introduced many policies that benefited millions of people. But one of the major problems was the lack and the continued reduction of collective strength. In fact, unfortunately, and I'm sorry to keep reminding people, but it is important to learn from our history. Unfortunately, Tony Blair boasted to a business audience that they had nothing to worry from a Labour government because Labour laws were the most restrictive in Western Europe. He took pride in saying that. He was right as well. We are the most restrictive. But of course, that restriction and the continued belief in the economic orthodoxy that has dominated the world up until 2008 of neoliberalism was about driving down wages and maximising profits. The cascade down, the trickle down theory that if everybody was wealthy at the top, eventually it would start trickling down and all of us would benefit, actually didn't materialise. And quite extraordinarily, and maybe a stain on a Labour government's period in office, the gap between the rich and poor actually grew for the first time in our history during Labour in government. Now what that means is that wealth is still being created. We're told at the moment that there is no money. We've all got to lose sleep because of the national debt. Of course, the truth is we are an incredibly wealthy nation. But the wealth is not being distributed fairly. And that's really what this debate is all about. How do you distribute? How do you protect the wealth creators, the workers of our nation? How can they get their fair slice of the cake? The amount of money paid as a percentage of our GDP in wages has gone down from 63% down to 55%, a dramatic drop in the last 15 years. And at last, economists are beginning to talk about this is wrong. They are now seeing that this is a fundamental structural problem in terms of having a sustainable economic growth. And of course, collective bargaining, the issues surrounding it, is what we are talking about as the only tool that will enable the proper distribution of wealth around our nation. You know, I heard Ed Balls this morning talk about Jaguar Land Rover. Tony's going to touch upon this this afternoon when he makes a speech. And he spoke about the tremendous developments that are taking place in the automotive sector, and he's not wrong in that. But once again, what was lacking in the speech, apparently the management, senior management teams are going to be brought in to assist the process, but no mention of the trade unions, of the workers, of the collective strength. Because I can tell you, very, very proudly, that it was my union that was instrumental in the resurgence and the renaissance of the automotive industry. In Jaguar Land Rover, it was our stewards, the workers who work day in, day out on the plant, who come up with innovative ways to commit to making Jaguar Land Rover such a huge success that it is. And the same in other particular automotive sectors as well. Vauxhall Motors, there's an interesting thing. John touched upon this in the point he was making. I was with the chair and the CEO of Vauxhall's only the other night, and they were talking about the successes that we've been able to work together to secure the plants in both Luton and Ellesmere Port. Fantastic success story. They're growing in terms of their market share within the UK, which is their largest market. But they have a smaller market within Germany, but a much more profitable market in Germany. The reason being that they can sell their cars at a higher rate, a higher price in Germany than in the UK. Because of course their standards of living, their standard of pay and salary and income is so much higher. This meant that during the course of the Thatcher period, when Britain was like a car boot sale, UK for sale, stuck on our islands, and come on in, take what you want, and they did. They came on in and they closed down factory after factory. They destroyed our manufacturing base, not to take it to the third world countries, but to take it to Germany and Spain and Italy and France. And that is a myth that we have to expose, that somehow organised labour has been responsible for the demise of the industries in manufacturing in our nation, because a rebalancing of the economy, and everyone talks about that, everyone, all the political class now talk about rebalancing the economy, whether they're Tories, Liberal Democrats or Labour Party. Everybody's now been won back over to the fact that we need to rebalance the economy. What they mean by that is we have to invest in our manufacturing base again, because people are suddenly beginning to realise that in order to get good quality services, whether that be in the public sector or the private sector, you need a vibrant manufacturing base. We need to get back to actually physically making things. We have to get back to raising living standards through wages, not going the opposite way down. Of course, the Tories talk about rebalancing the economy, but they're more than delighted to encourage the concept of 0 hours and encourage the continued attack on trade union rights, trying to reduce, and both Keith and John have spoke about that. And it is contradictory. And that's the argument that we need to get across to our Labour Party. And I have to say that I believe Ed Miliband is listening. I see in the audience John Monks, a good friend of ours for many, many years, who is trying to influence and work on the whole concept, in particular, John, of sectoral bargaining. So our party is beginning to listen, but we need, therefore, to raise it as high as we can in our agenda. Let me tell you a quick story about another automotive company. I, last year, visited the Rolls-Royce factory in Goodwood. And on the same day, I drove up to the Cowley factory in Oxford. Two iconic British cars, the Rolls-Royce and the Mini. Both owned now, of course, by BMW. And I asked the managing directors in both those plants the same question separately, and they gave me the same answer. And they're both German. And I said, tell me, what's the difference between Germany and the UK? What do you find? And they said, well, you know, we wouldn't want to be offensive. And I said, tell me. And they said, you don't seem to take manufacturing seriously. You don't seem to understand that the type of economic, the economy that we have in Germany is powered by our manufacturing base, and everything else flows from it. And they went through and explained to me about the supply chain. Again, Ed Bull's talking about it this morning, good stuff. And that's why we need to put meat on the bones, about how in Germany their supply chain is linked together. Every manufacturing plant I visit, and remember, we have 1 million members in Unite in the private sector. Every manufacturing plant I visit, all of the machinery, all of the kit is made in Germany or Sweden. Very rarely, in fact never, is it made here in the UK. When I was in the Cowley plant, the managing director said, look at this now. We were on the floor of the factory. A fantastic, iconic British car made by British workers in a British plant. But look here, and there's 600 robots. All of them are made in Germany. Why? Because I can't get them made in the UK. The reason is lack of investment. And so with the concept of collective bargaining, of strengthening the power of working people to get a fair share of their cake, we also have to link that with the investment that is needed in our manufacturing base. They told me of the input that they have with their trade unions. They wouldn't dream, they said, of entering into any kind of long-term plans, business plans and changes without discussing it with their trade unions, representatives of their workers. And they said, and our government embraces the type of added value that trade unions bring. Compare that with what happens here in our own nation, whereby trade unions are vilified. Trade unions are made to feel as though we are the enemy within. And that's a challenge to Ed Miliband, because at his speech in the TUC, I was delighted that Ed actually exposed the fact that this government, this Prime Minister, are attempting to use trade unions, to vilify trade unions in the most despicable way, cutting out a whole sector of the society in which we live, dismissing them as though we were the enemy within. And for too long within our own party, we felt uneasy. We felt not wanted. And that has to change. I have to say that coming to Labour Party conferences for many, many, many years now, in the last few years since Miliband's been in charge, I've noticed a warmer reception for trade unions at Labour Party conferences. But still, there is a problem that we have to overcome. Too many in the leadership of our party and those that influence them are worried about the media cycle, are worried that we'll have a bad headline in the Daily Mail. And therefore, although they're beginning to understand trade unions and want to work with trade unions, they're still uneasy about how that will play out in the media. It is our role, and the reason why I'm delighted that the campaign and IER have organised this fringe, it's our role to persuade people that there's nothing to be afraid of. We are the big society. We're the people who represent the aspirations of ordinary working people, who articulate the concerns of ordinary working people, and try to put forward alternatives to the path to poverty that this government has currently got us on. As John says, all the evidence shows that in countries where you have strong trade unions, you have less inequality. And where there is less inequality within a society, you have a more cohesive society, a society that is at ease with itself. So the message is a very simple one for me to the Labour Party. Trade unions are a force for good, and always have been. From the abolition of child labour, the fight for women's suffrage, the fight against fascism, the creation of the welfare state, right the way through to health and safety, equal pay, minimum wage and family-friendly policies that we have today, trade unions have always been on the side of the angels. And that is an issue that we should consistently make clear to people. We need to say that people should be proud of being trade unionists and being associated with trade unions. And I want to make this point as well, because the media are here and they're desperately hoping I'll say something controversial. Pauline's now got there it goes. If this government continues to attack us and continues to try and reduce our rights even further, let me warn them this. If you push us further outside of the law, then be it on your own heads what the consequences are. Because we've got no intention in Unite or in this movement of allowing laws introduced by the Bullingdon Boys to restrict the legitimate and international rights that we have to protect our workers. If we're pushed outside of the law, then so be it. But let us make certain that our values, the values that we treasure, the values of community spirit, the values of solidarity which courses through our very veins, let those values stand the test of time. Let those values that we've inherited from men and women, from our mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandfathers who fought and lost their lives to give us those freedoms. Let us proclaim that we will continue to fight for our rights in our party and in our nation to fight for those values.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, you see by the reception, I think this whole issue now of employment rights, collective bargaining, the fight back that the unions are committed to is something that's going to be very, very real for the future.